Welcome to another edition of Global Conversations. The topic tonight is China, Russia, hundreds of years wars against both Russia and China by the West, the United States and Europe. My guests tonight, both returning good friends, Eric Arnow from Chiang Mai, Thailand, an American, and Jeff J. Brown from Normandy in France, another American. These two gentlemen, I'd have to say, are experts on China, Chinese culture, Chinese history. So happy to have you guys back. Welcome back to the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here, especially with Eric, my good friend, and so it's nice for the three of us to get together and talk about such important issues.
Yeah, it's a great honor to be with both of you, actually.
Okay, so everybody today is talking about the Ukraine and the war, and I'm going to call it this: the war of the United States and its vassals in Europe against China, against Russia. This is not something new. This has been going on for decades, maybe hundreds of years. The two of you, when we communicated offline, indicated you'd like to talk about the wars against both China, Chinese Empire, Russian Empire, the Soviet Empire, going back maybe over 100 years. So I'm going to begin tonight with Eric. Eric, your thoughts on who, what, why, and where of these United States, European interventions in China and Russia. Your turn first. Take it away.
Okay. Well, when people say
whoa. Hey. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, when people say, "Oh, Russia invaded Ukraine," I just kind of roll my eyes, because you have to go back at least to the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, and even before then, Napoleon invading Russia in 1812. And before that, there were other invasions as well, going back even to the 12th century. The German Teutonic Knights, probably one of the most famous movies of the Soviet era was Alexander Nevsky, which was about the German invasion of Russia and how this famous Prince Alexander Nevsky, united the people, and he drove the Germans out. And interestingly enough, one of the major battles of that was the Battle of Poltava. I think that was Alexander Nevsky. There have been so many battles, I can't even keep them straight. But many of these battles took place in the area which is now called the Ukraine. And this is very important for people to realize what does Ukraine mean? It means borderland. In other words, it was this area that was in between the Moscow part of Russia, Kiev, which is considered the start of Russia as an entity, Kiev, which is now one of the main issues going on in this conflict, and everything points east. So Ukraine means borderlands. It wasn't the name of a country. It means it's this intermediary space, which had been fought over for centuries, and it's also been the doorway for further invasion into Russia. So I'll leave it at that for now.
So what you're saying then is that this is no surprise that Russia is being invaded. Russia has been invaded for hundreds of years, and most people will remember and will know it was Napoleon and then Hitler, and now it's the full force of the United States and its vassals in Europe. What is it, Eric, what is it that attracted all of these countries and made all of these invasions possible? What is it that they wanted?
Well, this is a very complex issue, but I would say there's basically two components to it. One is that Russia has an enormous amount of resources. And I'd like to refer people to a movie that was made in 1943, I believe, by the United States. I think it was narrated by directed by Frank Capra, called Why We Fight, The Battle for Russia. And in that, it starts off with a litany of praise for the Soviet Union and its valiant defeat the Nazis. General MacArthur and George Marshall and all these guys are saying, oh, the Soviets are so wonderful, and FDR is saying the Soviets are so wonderful for stopping these terrible Nazis. But at the beginning of the movie, they say, well, why? Why do they do this? And they say, it's because Russia is a rich country. It has agricultural resources, it has minerals, it has oil, it has coal, and people want it. And of course, Hitler's idea for taking over the world was that it didn't have enough resources to do that. So if they invaded Russia, they would get those resources and then they could expand globally. So that's one aspect of it. Second aspect of it is a religious aspect, because the pagan tribes, you could say, that inhabited the area of what we now call Russia were converted to Christianity by Orthodox Christians. And the problem there is that the Roman Catholic Church has other ideas. They think that they're supposed to be in charge of all of Christianity. And there's been many religious wars between them and the Protestants, but also they kind of resent the fact that Orthodox Christianity wants to be on its own. So that's another aspect of it. And the third aspect of it is there's a really kind of a racial component to it, where Hitler said the Slavic peoples they're not really human. And somebody recently, Jeff, maybe one of you remember this. There's a recent news item where some US government official said, Russians are not really like us. So that is a racist component to it. Racism, religion, coveting resources, those are three huge motivations for people to want to break up Russia, suppress the Russian population, and be done with them. They'll say, we've taken care of those guys.
Yeah, very true.
That's the story.
Very true.
Yeah. So, Jeff, let's go over to you. Do you want to make some comments about these invasions of Russia, or do you want to switch to China?
No. I think Eric's on. I think Eric is correct. I think that it really does go back to the Great Schism in 1054 AD, when the Eastern Christians, and I'm talking about basically Eastern Europe, Russia, and the Levant, Syria, Greece, split off from the Roman Catholic Church in Rome and established. They had been doing their own thing since Constantine in 400 something, but they officially split off in 1054 and created what was known as the Orthodox Church. And there's Russian, Arab, Greek that I know of. We cannot forget that after that, I don't think the West has ever forgiven Russia. At the Crusades in the 150 years later, everybody thought, oh, well, they went down and attacked Muslims in the Levant. Yes, they did, but they also slaughtered and exterminated millions of Slavic Orthodox Christians. So it was there were two parts to the Crusades, and the one branch one branch would break off and go slaughter and plunder and pillage and rape Slavic Orthodox. or Muslim, or Levant, Arab Orthodox or Greek Orthodox, and the others would plunder and pillage and rape the Muslims. So I don't think Russia has ever been forgiven. And Eric and I are members of a group of like an email group called China Writers Group, and there's a Russian lady in there called Irina Boyko, and she's really amazing. And I host her webpage on my website, and because she doesn't have her own, she has her own YouTube channels, but she doesn't have her own website. So I host her, and it's extremely popular. And she made a comment when we were talking about after Russia moved into Ukraine in February. She meant, and all these absurd sanctions against Tchaikovsky and Kandinsky and Yuri Gagarin. I mean, it's just insane. But anyway, she made the comment that Britain sanctioned and boycotted Russia during the reign of Peter the Great, and that was the end of the 17th century and the beginning of the 18th century. And I also want to point out that the king of Sweden, before that, King Charles VII, who was called the Bloody King because he was such a ruthless ruler. He also invaded Russia in the early 1700s and got his clock cleaned, like Napoleon and like Hitler. Very few people, get it and invade and stay in Russia for very long. But anyway, what I want to point out is that I've interviewed John Hobson twice, and his two books are really fabulous. But he pointed out that in the 1680s, with this confluence of Peter the Great literally putting Russia on the European map and creating a modern navy and making it a force to be dealt with, is likely why Britain tried to crush Peter the Great with sanctions. But it was at the same time in the 1680s, Europe also rejected all things China and made Islam the great enemy of Western civilization. And this is really, not only tragic, but, hypocritical, because it's these Eastern civilizations that gave Europe 95% of its science, technology, innovation, invention, agricultural, military, maritime development, and the Chinese and the Islam, brought in very refined culture, poetry, painting, literature, music, etc. And a lot of people don't realize how popular China was up until the 1680s, and Islam was accepted, at least in terms of maybe, well, after the Crusades. But after the Crusades, Islam was accepted as a huge font of information and philosophy. And so, but the French philosopher Voltaire and Germany's Gottfried Leibniz were two big Sinophiles. And before the 1680s, chinoiserie was everywhere in Europe. I mean, even in the middle class, furniture, paintings, maps, clocks, fabrics, clothing, porcelain, translated books, including Confucius's Analects and the Tao of Lao Tzu. Now, all of a sudden, in the 1680s, they pushed out China, demonized Islam, and said that there was a big bang, a racially superior Western ration, and as Eric mentions, the racism, Western rational thought made Europe great and powerful. And the Industrial Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, and all that was great and good in the world was now exclusively thanks to the innate native genius of Westerners. So this kind of ingrained, racism and supremism, I guess is the right noun, has been going on for a long time. And I can also point out that James Bradley, in his books on China, he pointed out that the founding fathers of the United States, Hitler did not invent the Aryan myth. The founding fathers of the United States were also all just infused with the Aryan myth of white racist superiority. They had the right to go in and exterminate everything in their path and take it over because they deserved it, because they were smarter, and always moving west, towards the setting sun. So Eric's right. This has been going on a long time, and Slavs are right down there with the Chinese in terms of racial degradation.
Yeah, Jeff, you made several good points. I want to just make a comment because I've commented on this an awful lot. American exceptionalism, and where did it come from? And you just articulated it very well. This has been nascent in Western European thinking for a long, long time. And it's really interesting that it took root in the colonies. John Winthrop, the city on the hill, we're blessed by God. And if we don't carry out this mission, he will make us a footnote in history. And from then, it was all about domination, moving west, across the landmass of the United States, out into the Pacific, and then eventually the entire world. Manifest destiny. It was the destiny of these ancestors of the white European colonialists to be able to, in the name of God, spread democracy and freedom in this American way of life around the world. Eric, we'll jump up to you.
I wanted to bring up a couple of points that were relative to what you were saying earlier, Jeff. Just before, I've known about this, but there's I don't know if I can do this. There's it's just like on Wikipedia. I did a search for Declaration of Native Americans. And in the Declaration of Independence itself, it talked about all of the terrible things that England was guilty of, but it also talked about the fact that the Native American savages were a problem and they needed to be dealt with. And another article mentioned that one of the ways that they dealt with this problem was by, and this is in 1700s, distributing smallpox-ridden blankets as gifts to the Native Americans. So we have not just the racial superiority and justification for genocide, but the beginnings of biological warfare.
Wow, very interesting. Jeff, jump up to you. You sent me a chat and you mentioned the West's 6 E's, E, the letter in the alphabet of racism.
Yeah, that's one of the things that I coined, the 6 E's of Western racism: expansionism, extermination, expropriation, extraction, enslavement, and evangelism. And it's true. It's true. I'm sorry to say, but it's true. It's just unbelievable. Eric brought up, the Native Americans. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz wrote the book, A Native American History of the United States. And she said A because she figured it was just one of many that the Native Americans shared. And as she said, as far as, war against the Native Americans started in, when was Jamestown? 1706 or
1609, I think.
Yeah, 1609. Yeah, they started exterminating Indians as soon as they got off the ship, and they didn't stop. And you know, when they arrived, that was Plymouth Rock, and then Georgetown was later. They started exterminating the Indians as soon as they got off the ship. She said that, you know, she said, you know, for us, we have been at war from the first time that the Europeans set foot on our lands. So it's just been going on. It has never stopped.
Well, you know, Jeff, as you probably know, Christopher Columbus set on Hispaniola, what is called, I forget, I think that's now
DR, the Dominican Republic and Haiti.
Haiti, right. And there were a whole bunch of people there called the Arawaks, and he immediately turned them into slaves.
Yeah.
And 10 of them were killed. So that was like from 1492.
Yeah.
So there's if you search around for T-shirts on the internet, you can find pictures of T-shirts with Native Americans with guns.
Fighting terrorism
since
1492. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah, in fact, the first English extermination and genocide of native peoples actually happened on the Canary Islands in 1402. The Gachwa, where there were 80,000 of them on the Canary Islands, and that's where the Spanish, they created what was known as the Canary effect, the Canary model, and that was what was adopted by all other European and then American settlers, as far as I'm concerned, genocidists, and they wiped those people out. There's nothing left of them, and it's, you know, get as much as you can out of them, act nice, be friendly, you know, get them to do stuff, you know, as much as they will, and then you capture the king, threaten to kill the king. They give up everything they've got. And once they've given up everything they've got and shown you where everything is, you slaughter the men, you rape the women, and, you know, and you enslave whoever survives. And that was actually called the Canary effect. And that's what Columbus and all the others did thereafter. So it was very, very effective, you know, to completely, again, exterminate, expansion and extermination. So it works every time.
Yeah,
unfortunately.
And it doesn't work. It doesn't work every time.
Well, I'm joking. I'm joking.
Yeah. What I mean is that it didn't work with the Russians.
Yeah, that's right. Getting back to Russia.
It didn't work with the Russians. Hitler was only able to kill 27 million of them, only 50% instead of 90%. And it didn't work with the Chinese, although the Chinese had more than one Holocaust during the 19th century. You had the Opium Wars, which you'll probably talk about in detail, and 20 million people, the Taiping Rebellion. China went through absolute hell for over 100 years.
Thanks to the West.
Thanks to the West, right? And then they wonder why Russia and China are getting together.
So
I can't imagine why they think that there's a problem from the West.
Yeah. Before we get to that, I want to go back to the origins of this white supremacy, this Western white racism, because in the history of the United States, it's been one lie built upon another. Jamestown, Plymouth Rock, the first Thanksgiving, glamorized, glorified the whole thing. And even slavery, was not called for what it really was. It had been going on for a few hundred years. And my good friend, S. Brian Wilson, has said that the first lie, where this American exceptionalism came from the very beginning, inherited in our DNA from these white Europeans. And he said, if you read the history of the United States, not Howard Zinn or not the Native American history of the United States, but if you read the history that we were taught, it all underlined this belief, this myth, this lie that we are an exceptional people blessed by God with this divine destiny. And it's really interesting, you know, going back to the Crusades and all the way to the white European colonial discoveries, all blessed by Rome.
Well, if I can interject, I read a really good book. I asked the guy to get on my show. He's a professor at Arizona State University. He's a Native American of a small tribe in Arizona. And he wrote an incredible book that just blew me away called Savage Anxieties. And the subtitle is The Myth of Western Civilization, which is a tongue-in-cheek subtitle. His name is Dr. Robert A. Williams, Jr. And he basically, I mean, he shows that this Aryan type mentality goes back to ancient Greece. And I used it I used it when I wrote the China trilogy. The Greeks were very expansionist. And unfortunately, they took from Mesopotamia, ancient Mesopotamia, they cultivated this idea of that anybody that's not them is a monster and non-human. And Gilgamesh, the first recorded book, at least in that part of the world, I know the Chinese probably could challenge that, but Gilgamesh was the first book in Mesopotamia, and he was the archetype of who needed to be exterminated. He was big, he was dumb, he was powerful, he was lazy, he didn't do any work, he just ate berries and found animals and just killed them and ate them. He had a dick the size of a horse's, and he raped women and took women and as he wished. You know, he was sex obsessed, and that model of the idea of the other, unfortunately, and it's in the Torah and the Old Testament, and so the Greeks got that, and that's why we have, you know, Cyclops and Titans and that Hector whatever animal, that Hector whatever monster with 100 arms that are knives. We have from 5,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, we have this idea that everybody that's not us is non-human, they're monsters, they're evil, etc. And as I pointed out in my writings, the monsters in China are almost like, you know, cute little cuddly animals. I mean, they're like unicorns. So this has and the Greeks adopted this, and then the Romans adopted it, and so this has been a part of our, as Regis said, this idea of the Greeks were expansionists, they were exterminators, they were expropriators, they were extractors, they enslaved. I don't know about evangelism, that came along with Christianity, but and we can't forget that the first great Greek foreign affairs initiative was Alexander the Great, who slaughtered his way across Egypt and all the way to Afghanistan. So, and then we had the Crusades. I mean, this has been going on for a long time, and then 500 years of race-based brutal colonialism, the 6 E's of racism across most of what we call today the developing world, including China. And as Eric pointed out, Russia has been one of the few that has been able to resist it. So, you know, and my friends don't like to hear this. My family doesn't like to hear this. People don't like me to talk about this, because as Eric said, or I think, no, it was Regis that talked about, the shining temple on the hill, John Winthrop, et cetera. We are so imbued with our greatness, and we are so imbued with our moral and cultural and scientific and human superiority over the rest of the world. And now we're in Ukraine, it all comes back, it just keeps coming back.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing about this racism, people have been talking, and people who are more enlightened have been talking about racism has become institutionalized in the United States throughout the entire culture, political fabric, whatever. And one of the big topics today is critical race theory. It's well, at least people maybe, I don't know, are now becoming more and more aware of it. But it didn't start in America. It didn't start with bringing Black Africans here. As you guys are pointing out, this goes back centuries.
Millennia.
Yeah, millennia. Yeah.
Millennia, yeah.
So let's this has been fascinating, guys. Let's shift gears and let's focus now on China and the invasions that have taken place in China. Eric, we'll go to you first.
Well, my gosh, China became China when with the Qin dynasty. Jeff knows a lot more about this than I do, to be honest with you. But China was a bunch of principalities and small kingdoms and so on, and eventually Emperor Qin united them all in a series of brutal campaigns, but he created what is now called China, which has been self-existent since about 2,500 years ago, but has been continually invaded ever since. And of course, there was something called the Great Wall, which was created. He was the first one who created it to keep these marauding tribes from the north from coming in. And China's been successively invaded by various people, including especially like the Mongols. And what is interesting about China is that it has resisted being wiped out by these invasions, and eventually they absorbed these people and they basically civilized their invaders. At least they have in the past. I can't say that they've civilized the Europeans. That didn't work out. But what the Chinese have done is by absorbing these attacks on itself, have in a way caused you could say a kind of a boomerang effect, where Chinese ideas have filtered out into the rest of the world. And there's a very interesting interview that was just done. It's on YouTube with a professor in Beijing University. He's an American, and he was talking about Chinese and specifically Confucian ideas, and saying that the basic difference, cultural or even perceptual difference, is that Confucianism and Chinese culture does not have such a strong ingrained sense of self, of separate self, that we are the product of our whole environment and we're not like a separate entity. Whereas in the West, we're considered a separate entity, and that is that results in this idea of me, selfishness, and eventually the idea of since I am preeminent, I get to do whatever I want, which now turns into rules-based order.
Yeah. Jeff, take it away.
Since I'm me, I'm the mighty U.S. and I'm me. I get to decide what is truth and what is false, and what is right and what is wrong.
Yeah. The other, Eric's got it right. The other, by the way, I do want to tell Eric mentioned the movie in 1943 about how great the Russians were. The Americans did the same thing with the Chinese during World War II. They had like movies like Gung Ho, which were pro-Chinese, that they were fighting the evil Japanese, fascists and all that. Well, as soon as they realized that Mao Zedong and the People's Liberation Army and the Communist Party of China were going to take over, and that they had the support of the entire country of 500 million people, that didn't last long. But anyway, if anybody wants to watch Gung Ho, I'm sure you can probably find it on YouTube because it's so old. But anyway, yeah, I think another important factor, and Eric brought up, this idea of the individual. I call it the Marlboro Man. If for anybody Americans who remember the Marlboro cigarette ads, with the rugged cowboy, with his saddle, and it is true. It's hard for Westerners to understand this, but the pyramid of social hierarchy is completely upside down. In the United States, it's me at the top, me, myself, and I. Family comes next, and depending on which family, traditional like Italians and Spanish and French, have stronger ties, but especially Anglo-Saxon families. Yeah. Then next comes your neighborhood, then comes your community, then comes your city, then comes your state, then comes your country, and your government, which everybody hates, And so that is the social hierarchy in the West. And you flip it upside down. You flip it upside down in China. The Marlboro Man is at the bottom of the dung heap. And then above that is family. And then above that is neighborhood, community, state, region, country, government, and leadership. So the Chinese considered, because they put the government and the leaders above the country because they are the ones that are supposed to make sure that the country is kept safe and maintains its borders. So everything is completely 180 degrees. I do want to point out one other thing, and Eric talked about the professor in Beijing. But it is also important to note that Western philosophy is based on morals and religion. Morals are great as long as you and I agree with each other. Morals are great. They work fine. But as soon as Eastern Christians and Western Christians don't agree, or Protestants and Catholics don't agree, then we got a problem. All right. So the philosophical foundation of China is ethics, and the only ethic that there is the golden rule: do unto others what you want done unto you. The Chinese, maybe there's a difference psychologically. The Chinese make it different. They say, don't do unto others what you don't want done to you, and that makes all the difference. And I think that is why, the Chinese have been able to prosper so much over the last 5,000 years, is because there was no moral right. There was everybody from the emperor on down to the child in the house were all expected to respect the golden rule. And I think that's a huge difference.
Well, also, as you to kind of append to that, in how it translates is zero-sum game, which is Western thinking, which is me versus you, where Chinese thinking is us, and we support each other and we all do better together, as opposed to it's I get all the toys and you don't, and that makes me the winner.
Now, is that communism? Is that Confucianism?
Well,
No, wait a minute. Don't bring we can't use that word.
You know, Regis, it's funny you brought that up because in the prologue of my third China book, the Big Red Book on China, I have a picture of Karl Marx and Emperor Shang, who was the first recognized. I mean, there were obviously others, but the first important Chinese emperor, and of course, Eric mentioned it was not totally unified, but he had a big chunk of China. And it was Emperor Shang in 1700 BC. And I put them together in a montage at the top of the chapter and said that the hardest thing for Westerners to understand is that the Chinese have been communists for 5,000 years. And Eric said it, communalism, again, ethically based, treatment of other people, taking care of others, sharing things, etc. I mean, has China been a utopia? No, it never has been. But the ideal is there in the minds of everybody from Xi Jinping down to a local, mayor in a small village. So yes, China has been communist for 5,000 years, and that's why. Mao and Chen and the other guys who started the Chinese Communist Party in 1921 was like, well, we've been doing this for millennia. So let's just give it a name.
So why is it then that this idea of community, unity, everybody together working, sharing for the betterment of the group, so alien and so hated and despised by the West, which you guys have described as really me first?
I don't know if even our governance, Greece was not unified. There were tens and tens and tens of city-states spread out all the way up into Turkey and up into the Caucasus, and the Greeks were all over the place. They were just like all different languages, different systems of governance and everything else. Most of them were totalitarian eventually, and it's just we have and I don't think we're going to get rid of it. This idea of being independent and free from others and everything else goes a long, 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 long way back. I mean, after the fall of Mesopotamia, Abraham, wandered around in the desert and ended up in the Levant, and he was an individual. We have this idea. Moses went to the mountain and came up with the 10 Commandments. We have this idea of the Marlboro Man is so imbued in our DNA. I don't think we'll ever get rid of it, but I think the only thing we can do is just recognize it and understand it and try to mitigate it. So anyway, I've been wanting to write an article about this. China is clan based, and the West is race based, and all these. It's just I want to do a table and just go down the list, because it is like Venus and Mars. Like that famous book about men and women, it is like Venus and Mars. They have nothing in common, almost nothing, except that they're all human.
So what I'm aiming for, and we've talked about, is this war between the United States and Russia and China. The United States is threatening, intimidating both Russia and China simultaneously militarily. But I want to go back to a little bit more of the Chinese history and the Opium Wars. Eric, let's begin with you, and then you can pass the baton to Jeff.
Okay, Jeff knows a lot more about this, but what I will say is that I visited China in 2007. I met a Chinese monk there because I went to China originally because of my interest in Buddhism, or Zen, which originated in China. And this particular monk said, "Oh, you need to go to Xiamen, which is a port city it's like in the southeast coast of China." And as I read about the history of that city, it was basically muscled in by the Japanese, Germans, British. It became a treaty port. And it was the two things about this port which are famous. One, it was the port from which the tea was sent from China to the Boston Harbor and was dumped overboard. So that was its first claim to fame. But the second one was that it was a real entry point for all the opium that was coming into China, that was forced upon China, because China was so successful economically that it was drained. There was a tremendous imbalance of payments between the Europeans, specifically England, and the Chinese. And the British were saying, how are we going to solve this problem? Well, let's just go in with our gunboats and force them to buy opium from us, get them all addicted, and that'll solve our balance of payments problem. Take it away, Jeff.
Well, yeah, that's basically what happened. China has always been bigger, better, faster, and cheaper throughout history. And the British had wool, and guns. And that was really about all they had to offer the Chinese, and maybe some lumber, but the Chinese invented guns. And the Chinese had silk. They didn't need soggy, smelly wool. So the British really had nothing, and they were paying for all that chinoiserie that I was telling you about, all that furniture and all that silk and all those wonderful things. That's the tea, of course. I should have brought up tea, but I didn't list tea. But of course, tea was a huge factor. The British and the rest of Europe were paying in silver. And they were basically getting their, of course, the Spanish, the Pontosí mine in Bolivia, was feeding, a tsunami of silver to Spain, which went into debt, and all they spent it on was just aristocratic, frivolity. So they had to pay England in silver. To pay all the debts that they got for all their wars. But England was running out of silver. And so at the same time, a guy in Guangzhou, what is today Hong Kong.
Guangzhou?
Well, Guangzhou, yeah. The Chinese guy that burned up all the opium in the harbor. They kept sending letters to the Queen of England. Stop sending this opium. Stop sending this opium. Stop sending this opium. It was bad for the people. But they kept sending it, and unfortunately, there was enough corrupt Chinese that it was getting into the country. A lot of contraband, up and down the coast. And so this famous, his name was Liu, I think, L-U. He burned up a warehouse of British opium, quite a bit. Well, the Queen of England back then, Queen Elizabeth, she said, of course, Queen Victoria, I'm sorry. She said, well, let's see, what do we do here? And she realized that if they could not sell opium, push opium into China, that would represent, as some people say 15%, others say 25% of England's GDP. It was huge. And it also made India prosperous because that's where the opium was grown. And so she basically became and can still make claim to operating the longest running, biggest drug cartel in the history of the world. And
Let me ask you just to interject here. My understanding is that England basically stripped India of its industrial potential because it was manufacturing using cotton to make textiles and things like that, and it forced the Indians to grow opium. But the Indians weren't getting rich off of that. The British were.
Well, yeah, the British were the East India Trading Company. Yeah. Well, John Hobson will tell you that it's a little bit more nuanced than that. There were other factors. The British obviously did not help the Indians prosper, so there were other factors there was drought and there was other issues and et cetera. But it's and then basically what happened, Britain got Hong Kong, and then the second war was France, Italy, Sweden, and unfortunately Russia back then was an imperial power. And they said, "Hey, we want in on this gangbang too. We want to rape and pillage 400 million people too." The United States, of course, was in that in the second one, and that's when they really blew the doors open on China. The Chinese were too big and they could never overrun the country like overrun it. But they had, like you said, they had these cities where they were able to funnel stuff in, and it was the United States and England controlled the opium trade, and then the rest of and then all the other European capitalist, colonialist, imperialists were able to bring in their products, of course, tax free, and basically rob and plunder China and take all that booty back home. So that's why since 1839, the Chinese call 1839 to 1949, when they had communist liberation, they called it their century of humiliation. 25% of the people, up to 25% of the people, were addicted to opium. Imagine, and of course, every family member was affected. So it was a huge percentage of the population. Imagine every fourth house on your street with being a drug den. And that's basically what it was in China for 110 years. So I ride on China, and joining hands with Russia to fight the West around the world, and now in Ukraine, and I'm confident they will succeed.
Yeah, well, the beat goes on with the drug trade.
Well, it's all CIA now.
Yeah,
The CIA controls
but
heroin, cocaine, human trafficking for prostitutes for all the American soldiers around the world. They control the money laundering. They control the money laundering and the gun running. So the CIA is basically, as Douglas Valentine said, is the organized crime syndicate for global capitalism, and that's the way it works.
Yeah. So what we've seen, gentlemen, because we're coming up on an hour, we've seen millennia of expansionism, as Jeff said, extermination, expropriation, extraction, enslavement, and evangelism. And we see it now playing out again on a global stage in the Ukraine. And Jeff, you mentioned in the very beginning that all of these assaults, these invasions, these attacks on China and Russia have driven them today closer together. I think the Chinese have said, and Xi has said, we have something more than an alliance, economic, political.
It's like a brotherhood.
Yeah, and militarily. I want your concluding remarks on, we've seen how we got here. What do you think is going to be the significance going forward with this conflict in Ukraine? It's not really a civil war. It isn't really a war between the United States and Russia, it's something much more global.
Go
Jeff?
ahead, Eric. You go
Okay.
ahead, Eric.
Eric,
You
go
go
ahead.
ahead. Because it's more about Russia, and that's much more your specialty than mine.
What Russia did after, first of all, the Second World War never ended. Let's be clear about that. While the Second World War was winding down, Churchill was already making plans to reinvade Russia using Wehrmacht forces. They were going to re-equip them and reinvade the Soviet Union. So after the Soviet Union took a bosh on that, Truman realized it wasn't going to work. The Soviet Union was too strong. And even though the Soviet Union, even though Truman exploded atomic bombs to show Stalin that, don't mess with us, we're tough, the USA, we're going to clean your clock, we're going to nuke you if you do anything funny. Still, the Soviet Union was able to overcome that, and the Cold War ensued. The Cold War was declared by the West to isolate the Soviet Union from Europe because they were afraid that the Soviet Union was too appealing to Western populations. Hey, you mean we can have free education and free healthcare and childcare and have the society work for us instead of all the money being sucked up to the royalty? Yeah, we'll go for that. Well, of course, the British and the French and all these other people, the imperialists wouldn't put up with that. So they were the ones who were responsible for the Iron Curtain. Foolishly, the biggest mistake that the Soviet Union made was trusting the West and thinking that they could end the Cold War and become friends with the West. And there was a lot of Russians who entertained that idea, and they were wrong. And it took them 30 years of humiliation at the hands of the West to realize this isn't working. And what Putin did starting in 2000 when he became president was rearming and re-equipping and making Russia strong enough both militarily and economically so that when the real push came to shove, Russia would be able to stand up, which is exactly what's happening now in Ukraine. NATO was pushing. They refused to negotiate. They were threatening nuclear capable bombers flying off the coast of Russia. The people in the Donbass being physically bombed and shelled on a daily basis, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. Finally, the dictatorship, quote unquote, of Russia, that is the Duma, the Russian parliament, had a resolution that said, Putin, will you please declare the Donbass republics as separate countries, and so that they can get our direct help instead of pretending that they're really part of Ukraine. They're never going to be part of Ukraine. And Russia knew that there was going to be consequences for that. And so what they did was they got their back covered by China saying, hey, if we're sanctioned, will you buy our stuff? And China said, sure, we will. And so, and the other thing that Russia did was they linked the ruble to gold, which is a direct attack on the US dollar. So going forward, there's a distinct possibility that Russia will clearly win in Ukraine. The only issue that we have to face is how desperate and how criminal the people are who are running the West, specifically the United States and England, I would say as well. Are they crazy enough to do something really, really over the top, like stage a false flag nuclear or chemical attack, which would result in, the unthinkable? That's where we're going. That's
I'm going to end it on this note. We're going to do a similar show again with both of you very, very soon. There's so much more to talk about.
Yeah, I wanted to hear about the Crimean War. I know nothing about it. Next time.
Next time. What I wanted to end with was this. What we really are talking about is an epic battle of civilizations and cultures. It's an epic battle that's going to determine the future construct of the world.
Mhm.
Is it going to be the millennia old white Western European imperial unipolar order that has taken the world to the brink of extinction, by the way? Or is it going to be this more multipolar or communal world that has been espoused by China and Russia for a long, long time? And I said at the end of my film, 30 Seconds to Midnight, will those crazed, I call them neocons, it's not accurate, will those crazed, whoever they are, in London and the United States, recognizing they've lost this epic battle, take the whole world down with them in a nuclear Armageddon? And I fear that's where we are today.